Thank you for the kind.
It's a pleasure.
I'd like to thank Dr. Gold for the kind introduction. And I must tell you, getting to Mexico City to give a keynote last week was easier than getting to Pittsburgh. I almost didn't get here. I don't know if you know about the storm in Chicago yesterday, but I rebooked through Denver, and then when I got to Denver, I found out my crew was in Chicago. Anyway, so I got here. It's a miracle. So I was determined to get here. I said the show must go on. I'm very pleased to be here. I have not been in Pittsburgh since I was visiting Barbara Sizemore at the Cathedral of Learning building, and that must have been at least 30 years ago. So as I flew into Pittsburgh, I did think of Barbara Sizemore and Asa Hilliard because we had a meeting here. I don't remember the details, but I do remember the Cathedral of Learning. Before I begin, I wanted to thank Dr. Rich Milner. Is Dr. Milner? I wanted to recognize him and thank him for inviting me, and also to praise him a little. I think one of the things we need to do is support each other as we move around the country. I wanted to thank him for the wonderful work that he has done at the Center for Urban Education, for putting it on the map, and for doing such excellent work. I also wanted to recognize his many publications and accomplishments, including his contributions to AERA, the American Educational Research Association, and to recognize him and to let you know that he will be giving a very prestigious AERA lecture next year, the 2019 Brown Lecture. I just wanted to recognize my brother this morning. The title of my talk is Diversity in America, Teaching Students to Know, to Care, and to Act. I don't usually need a mic because I'm from a black preacher's tradition, so I hope this isn't too loud for you. Is it? It's okay. Okay, the title of my talk is Diversity in America, Teaching Students to Know, to Care, and to Act in Global Times. In various parts of my presentation, I will indicate how this title relates to the focus of this forum for practicing educators. In other words, how it relates to culturally responsive education. Again, the title of my talk is Diversity in America, Teaching Students to Know, to Care, and to Act in Global Times. The diversity within the United States and the world presents both challenges and opportunities for educators. First, I will describe the challenges of diversity in global times, and then the opportunities it provides. We are living in difficult times in both the United States and around the world. More than ever, we need thoughtful, active, and committed citizens who will act to make the U.S. and the world more just and humane. At this very difficult time in our history, hard times at home and abroad test a nation's values and resolve. The histories of groups such as African American, Mexican American, American Indians, and Jewish American teach us that out of desperation comes hope, and out of oppression come possibilities, and that even dark times provide an opportunity to affirm our commitment to human freedom and to social justice. The troubled and challenging times in which we live demand teachers and educators who have a vision and a deep commitment to values such as justice and equality, values that were at the heart of the civil rights movement and of the dream of which Martin Luther King spoke so eloquently. We are living in difficult times that try our souls. Schools, colleges, and universities need to address issues of social justice in addition to teaching the basic skills required by the Common Core and the Every Student Succeeds Act. This is a very important issue today because of the problems that the U.S. and the world face, including the widening gap between the rich and the poor, the threats to democracy around the world, and global warming, and even not to mention refugees throughout the world who are often denied entry at our borders and at other national borders. So that the whole issue of standards are placing a real challenge in testing and standard. All students, of course, need to master basic skills in writing, reading, and math. However, these skills are necessary, but they are not sufficient in order to provide students with a culturally responsive education. Students need to read and write, but that's not enough. I am deeply concerned about an education that is narrowly defined as academic achievement and basic skills. We should be educating students to be reflective, moral, and active citizens in a troubled world. The world's greatest problems do not result from people being unable to read and write. The world's greatest problems result rather from people in the world, from different cultural, races, religions, and nations being unable to get along and to work together to solve the world's momentous problems, such as global warming, poverty, racism, sexism, and war. Examples of the conflicts between the Western and Arab nations, North Korea and its neighbors, and the refugees in various regions of the world who are being denied entry to Western nations, which could provide them with safety and protection. Most of the refugees are escaping countries where they feel threatened, they feel endangered, and yet many nations are accepting very few of them. Clearly, skills in numeracy and literacy are essential for citizens in a democratic and global world. However, they are not sufficient. Some of the most unconscionable acts that have been committed in the world have been done by highly literate nations and cultures. Germany was one of the most literate nations in the world when its leaders presided over the death of 12 million people, 6 million Jews in the Holocaust, and 6 million other targeted groups, including people with disabilities and people who were gay. Keep in mind that Germany was the epitome of culture and civilization. It was the land of Beethoven, of Bach, and Max Weber, the famous sociologist. Many years ago, a young principal put this letter in the mailboxes of all of the teachers on the first day of school. It said, "Dear teacher, I'm the survivor of a concentration camp. My eyes saw what no human being should witness. Gas chambers built by learned engineers, children poisoned by educated physicians, infants killed by trained nurses, women and babies shot and burned by high school and college students. So I'm suspicious of education. My request is, help your students become human. Your efforts must never produce learned monsters, skilled psychopaths, and educated Eichmanns." End of quote. Reading, writing, and arithmetic are important only if they serve to make students more humane. In addition to teaching basic skills, Schools, colleges, and universities need to educate students for cultural and global citizenship and social justice. This is an education that not only educates students' heads, but also their hearts. By a cultural and global citizenship education for social justice, I mean an education that teaches students to know, to care, and to act. And I will return to these goals later in my talk and back in with this refrain. We need to teach students to know, to care, and to act. This is the essence of culturally responsive teaching. It is the essence of restructuring our schools so that they help students become effective citizens in a challenging world. The United States is changing. That's one of the reasons we need to change the curriculum, to make it more culturally responsive, to make it more diverse. The diversity in the United States is changing tremendously, and it is challenging us in order to educate students for a global society. The world is coming to the U.S. by close to 1 million immigrants each year, most of whom are coming from nations in Asia and Latin America. A significant number also coming from the Caribbean and Africa. Between 2006 and 2015, 81.6% of the legal immigrants to the U.S. came from nations in Asia and Latin America. 9% came from Africa, and just 8.2% came from Europe. In 2015, people of color made up 38% of the total U.S. population. There were 11.1 million undocumented immigrants in the U.S. in 2014, and this number has been steady since then. The percentage of the total U.S. population in 2015 was approximately 321.5 million. Non-Hispanic whites were 61.6% of the population, and people of color were 38.4% of the population, and about 123.5 million people. And one of the very interesting facts is that there were, and maybe the next slide show it, about the Asians now represent a third of the foreign-born population in the U.S., equal with the Mexican foreign-born population. They also represent 14% of the unauthorized population. That number will grow in the coming decades. Indian, South Korean, and Chinese are the fastest growing segment of the undocumented immigrants, not Mexicans. Not Mexicans. And one of the interesting facts that you can tell people who are afraid that whites are becoming a minority, spread the good news that they are 61.9% of 6% of the population, and they are not projected to become a minority until around 2050. Spread the good news. And not only that, but many of us won't be around by 2050, so that people don't have to worry about as much as they thought they had. How are our schools changing? In 2014, a report from the National Center for Education Statistics indicated that students of color accounted for 50.3% of the public school population in that year, so it's exceeded the white population. I'd like for you to see if you could work with a partner, which 15 states where people of color are majority. See if you can list those states. It's about 15 of them. Okay, let's see how well you did. They are listed there alphabetically. How well did you do? Pretty well? Okay. The next slide will list them in order of the percentage, from the highest to the lowest. So which one do you think is at top? So you guys, being out here in Pennsylvania, don't think of Hawaii as being America. You don't think about it, do you? Here they're listed by percentage. Any surprises? Okay, so that's a very interesting group of statistics. So schools, colleges, and universities, therefore, are characterized by rich ethnic, cultural, language, and religious diversity. Immigrants are the fastest growing part of the child population in the U.S. 1 out of 5 children in the U.S. is the children of immigrants. By 2040, it is projected that 1 out of every 3 students enrolled in U.S. schools will be the child of immigrants. Okay, one of the things I argue that a major goal should be to teach students to know, to care, and to act. And if we're going to want to teach students to know and care and to act, we must, as teachers, know, care, and act. And one form of action is reading. Reading is a form of action. And so in my lecture, I will be suggesting some books for you to read after this institute in order to act. And one of them is a book by Suarez Orozco, Carolla, and Marcelo called Children of Immigration. It's an excellent book that talks about many of the trends I've talked about. Another book by them is called Learning a New Land, Immigrant Students in American Society. And the second book I'm recommending is a book I edited with Marcelo called Global Migration, Diversity, and Civic Education. Another diversity that's increasing enormously within the United States and the world is religious diversity. Diana Eck, a professor of religion at Harvard, states in her book, and please add her book to the list, Diana Eck, E-C-K, the book is called A New Religious America. She states, and I quote, that the U.S. is the most religiously diverse nation on earth. And a question for you, what do you think is the fastest growing religion in the United States? Islam. What is the fastest growing religion in the world? Islam. It's the fastest growing religion in the world. The American Council on American Islamic Relations estimates that about 20,000 Americans convert to Islam each year. Now, what is two of the reasons? I don't want to take too much time because I want to get through my lecture. But what is one of the reasons that why would someone convert to a religion that's been as criticized as Islam? What is one of the reasons? Very fast. Marriage is one reason. Another reason is young white kids who are in search of their identity. Some of them are becoming Islam, joining Islam because of they're searching for some deeper meaning in their lives. Perhaps I can talk about that later in the lecture. Again, some more good news for whites. The U.S. Census project, as I mentioned earlier, that by 2050, non-Hispanics whites will make up about 50% of the population, so they still will be significant. To know, to care, and to act. By knowing, I mean not only the ability to master, access, and use factual knowledge, but also the ability to challenge its assumptions, to interrogate knowledge, and to reconstruct knowledge. I also mean the ability to create, evaluate, and take knowledge, and to use knowledge thoughtfully and creatively. Freire, that's the book I mentioned. Let me move on. Freire, in his book, Pedagogy of the Press, states that we must teach students to read the word in the world. Freire says that we must, by the way, add his book to the list, Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Press. He states that we must teach students to read the word in the world. Reading the word requires basic knowledge and skills. Reading the world requires students that question assumptions, paradigms, and use knowledge to make the world more just and humane. Because of the ways in which people are moving back and forth between national boundaries, we need to educate students to be cosmopolitan citizens of the world and help them to learn how to be flexible citizens who can cross borders and become cosmopolitans. Educators must conceptualize ways to educate students to be citizens in multiple nation states or to be global citizens. Two other books to notice. R.Y. Ong's calls this notion flexible citizenship. Will Kimler calls it multicultural citizenship. Two key ideas I'd like for you to keep in mind. One of the reasons for this change, the need to educate students to be global citizens in a changing world, is because of worldwide immigration. The number of people living outside their nation of birth grew from 120 million in 1990 to 244 million in 2015. Migrants who live outside their nation of birth made up 3.3% of the world's population of 7 billion in 2015. Since World War II, nation-states throughout the Western world have become more diversified because of immigration and other factors. Ethnic and cultural diversity in Western European nations, such as the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and the Netherlands, increased greatly after World War II. And groups from the former colonies of these nations in Asia, Africa, and the West Indies immigrated to Europe to satisfy labor needs and to prove their economic status. When I first went to Europe to do research on ethnic groups at the University of Birmingham, I encountered a book called The Empire Strikes Back, Race and Racism in Britain. And by the way, the people in England told me at the time, racism is an American problem. It's not a problem for us. Well, they changed their tune after the riots in the 70s, in the 80s that they experienced. Anyway, what is The Empire Strikes Back about? It's about, in effect, the chicken come home to roost. The people that you have colonized, the people such as Algeria by France, the West Indies by England, they were coming to Europe to try to belong to the country that had conquered them. They were trying to become citizens of these nations. And it's a complicated story. When I got to Europe doing research in the 70s, they were, in England, they were still calling third-generation Jamaicans immigrants. This has improved somewhat in Europe now. The increase in international migration, the tightening of national borders, and the quest by minoritized groups intensified in the 60s and 70s, and the growth in the number of nation states make a new conception of citizenship education really critical. I'm going to really, this is just a slide on countries that have, the 10 countries with the largest number of international immigrants. Notice that the United States is one, Russia is one, and that's primarily because when Russia broke up, it became many different nations. And of course, it's important to keep these kind of facts in mind as we look at what's happening of educating citizens to become effective in a global world. Another book I'd like for you to add to the list is a book by de Blige called The Power of Place, Geography, Destiny, and Globalization's Rough Landscape. In this significant book, de Blige challenges Friedman's notion that globalization has created a flat world. You probably know that The World is Flat, a very famous book. De Blige challenges that notion. He distinguished between three kinds of immigrants: the global, the mobiles, and the locals. Globals are the world's globetrotters who cross borders easily and have power and influence. The world for them is flat. These are the Microsoft millionaires who live in Hong Kong, in Seattle, in Paris. These are the globals. Who are the mobiles? Mobiles are risk takers who become migrants to improve their lives. Globals and mobiles constitute the 200 million people who are international migrants. However, what are locals? Locals are the people who are the poorest group. They're the most powerfully influenced by place. Most locals, most of them, remain within the communities in which they were born all of their lives. In Chicago, many inner city black kids rarely visit the Museum of Science and Industry in Hyde Park. So most of your students would be which of these three groups? Locals, because it is the locals that characterize most of our lives. The growth in the international migration, increase of cultural inequality within nation states, and the growing recognition and legitimacy of international human rights have problematized issues related to citizenship. And so that we need to be very cognizant of how do we help kids who are primarily locals develop a sense of cultural identity, national identity, and global identity. The refusal of the French government, how is France dealing with diversity? Not very well. The French government has passed a law which prohibits Muslim young women from wearing the hijab or the headscarf in school. What do you think is the reaction of the students? Many students who hadn't thought of wearing a hijab, when it was prohibited, guess what they said? Give me one. Give me a hijab. Because what they saw France as challenging their identity. So it was a bad policy. So the more you take away people's symbols of identity, the more they wanted them to exist. The Black Civil Rights Movement, by the way, has been influential throughout the world. When I was in Belfast, in Northern Ireland, I saw murals that depicted Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. So the Black Civil Rights Movement has been influential throughout the world. So what is the goal of diversity in citizenship within the nation, within nations? Nation states must balance unity and diversity. Diversity and unity should coexist in a delicate balance in nation states. Unity without diversity results in cultural repression and hegemony. An example is the Cultural Revolution in China between 1966 and 1976. Also, the breakup of the Soviet Union. What happens with unity? So diversity without unity is also not effective. It leads to balkanization and the fracturing of the nation state. An example of the partition of India, which led to the establishment of three foreign states, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and the Republic of India. So we need to balance unity and diversity needs to be balanced. This is just a footnote. I wanted to point out that religion is growing in the global south in nations such as Africa and parts of Asia. But religion is declining in the global north. And a book about religion growing in the global south is God is Back, How the Global Revival of Faith is Changing the World. Multicultural and global citizenship education is one of the major goals of the Center for Multicultural Education that our center directs at the University of Washington. Our center sponsors a conference on ethnic diversity and citizenship education in multicultural nation states at the Rockefeller Foundation's center in Bellagio, Italy in 2002. A book based on that conference is Diversity and Citizenship Education, and you can add that book to the list. And the next slide shows the nation states, 12 nations that participated in that conference. And the major question for that conference was, how does nation states educate citizens so that they can retain their cultural identity, and yet where they can be black and American, where they can be Mexican American and American? So that we can develop an identity, because identity is complex and identity is contextual. How can nation states educate citizens so that they will have a delicate balance of national and cultural identity? For example, I often teach that identity is multiple, contextual, and overlapping. When I gave a lecture in the United Kingdom at the University of London 2 years ago, I asked the audience, what did they think my primary identity was when I landed at the Heathrow Airport? What do you think my primary identity is when I land at the Heathrow Airport? A black American, black man American. But what is my identity before I land? That is, but when I land in London, what does it become? American. Becomes my overarching identity. Becomes American. Before I land, I'm a black male. Then when I land, my primary identity becomes American. So the goal of this conference was to ask, how can we educate students so that they will keep their cultural identity, their national identity, and their global identity? We also produced a report that you can download free from our website called Democracy and Diversity. That was a report that followed the Bellagio conference. And you can go to the Center for Multicultural Education, and you can download a copy of that publication free. Do it soon, because the center will get a new director, and I'm not sure he's going to keep up the publications that I have on that website. We identified 10 key concepts for teaching students about diversity and for teaching students helping them to become effective citizens. And one of the concepts we identified was multiple perspective and sustainable, and one was sustainable development. Why was sustainable development important? We point out, for example, that the nations in North America, Western Europe, and East Asia consume more than their share of the world's resources, when fair share is determined by proportion of the world's population. The United States, for example, has only 1/20th of the world's population, but consumes 1/5 of the world's resources. We should think about that as we eat our steak for dinner. This PowerPoint keeps disobeying. The other major point we make in that publication that I suggested that you download, we introduced the concept of intersectionality. Intersectionality. And what do we mean by that? We mean that a Mexican-American student is not only a Mexican-American student. She also has a gender. She also has a sexual orientation, religious and non-religion. In other words, these variables intersect. You can't understand diversity as it's manifested in an individual by looking at only the one variable, whether they're Mexican-American, whether they're religious, or whether they are gay or lesbian. You have to look at these factors together. They intersect and they are interactive. Intersectionality, then, describes the ways in which the variables of diversity intersect and interrelate. These interactions are myriad and complex. To implement a culturally responsive education, teaching must reflect intersectionality, not just one variable looking at me as a black man, but also looking at my other characteristics. I'm supposed to be a black Methodist, for example. I go to church occasionally. But that's one of my identities that goes and comes. I mean, it stays there basically, but the level of identity varies. So I think that we need to look not just at what people look like, but what their identity are and how do the variables of identity intersect. That's just telling you how to download that report, but rather than looking at the URL, just go to the Center for Multicultural Education and download the report, Democracy and Diversity. My center had a second conference, a follow-up conference to the 2002 conference in 2015. And we had 16 nations represented at this conference, and they are listed there on the overhead. Again, we were trying to look at how do we structurally include diverse groups and yet let them maintain some sense of peoplehood, their language, and diversity. And we had 18 nations represented at this conference. And the book for it is there. Okay, what is the main goal then of what I've been trying to say? The main goal should help students to develop a cultural identification, a national identification, a regional identification, which is particularly important if you're in Europe or Asia, and a global identification. And that these identifications interact and overlap. Historically, what have the schools done about schools' identity? They've asked kids to leave their identity at the schoolhouse door. They said, don't speak Spanish in this school. If you do, you will get sent to the corner. For many years, Mexican-American kids were prohibited from speaking Spanish. And other languages were banned from the school. Here are some examples. Joe Springs calls this process deculturalization. in his book, Deculturalization and the Struggle for Equality. Please add it to your list. Angela Valenzuela calls this process subtractive schooling, of how schools strip, in her case, Mexican-American students of their cultural identity. But it just wasn't minoritized folks of color that experienced deculturalization. In a wonderful article in the Harvard Educational Review in the 1970s, William Greenbaum talks about how ethnic groups such as Jews and Italians were taught hope and shame. Shame, they were made ashamed of their language, such as Yiddish and Italian. But they were given hope that if you give up Yiddish and learn standard English, you can have inclusion. So he talks about the notion of hope and shame. But what happened if you were black and gave up your language and culture? You got shame, but no hope, or little hope. So that, to some extent, that still exists. So what should be the goal of the schools then? Should help students affirm their cultural identity, affirm their language identity, because they can be effective African Americans as well as effective American citizens. The schools should also help students to develop democratic attitudes and values. Amy Gutman, in her book that you can add to the list called Democratic Education, argues that schools should provide students with civic equality, recognition, and toleration. By the way, my students don't like the word toleration. But I think Amy Gutman, by the way, she was at our conference in Bellagio in 2002. She's now president of Penn, so some of you might know her name. This is Pennsylvania, isn't it? She's president of the University of Pennsylvania. I think that I kind of defend Amy Gutman when my students criticize this concept, because I think all she means is that you may not be gay, but you accept people who are. She means kind of an acceptance of differences, which may be different from your own. But again, my students don't like the word toleration. By civic equality, she means that the student should have equal rights within the classroom and in culture. And by recognition, that's the one I want to focus on right now, she means that students are seen in the curriculum. I grew up in the South in the 50s and 60s, where there were almost no blacks on TV except Amos and Andy. And now almost none of you are old enough to remember Amos and Andy. Your mother would. But it was a stereotypic black show. Therefore, when Nat King Cole came on the TV, guess what happened? The whole family came. Nat King Cole is on TV. And so we'd come and look. And what is that concept? Recognition. So when students see themselves in the curriculum, when students see their images reflected in the curriculum, that is motivating. And Amy Gutman used the concept of recognition to talk about that notion. Martha Nussbaum argues that we should also teach students cosmopolitanism. She defined cosmopolitans as students who have a commitment and identity to the worldwide community of human beings. She said education should help students to develop cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism is an open and broad open-mindedness that transcends one's own group, whether defined by family, locality, religion, ethnicity, or nationality. Cosmopolitans view themselves as citizens of the world. However, she raises this important question that cosmopolitanism pursues. How can we educate students so that they will identify as much with the dying people in Syria as they identified with the Americans who died in 9/11? That is a powerful question. How can we get our students to identify as much with the Syrian refugees as they can to Americans who are experiencing tragedies? However, Nussbaum points out that to be a cosmopolitan citizen of the world, one does not need to give up local affiliations, which can be a source of great richness in life. I don't have to give up being black to be a cosmopolitan. As a matter of fact, I'm a better cosmopolitan if I'm anchored in my own culture. Because I cannot love others if I don't love myself. I got to love myself first, accept myself, before I can reach out and accept others. So we do not have to give up our local affiliations to be cosmopolitans. That's a very interesting point. Another cosmopolitan, and I recommend his book called, it's at the bottom of the slide, Cosmopolitanism, Ethnics in a World of Strangers. And it's a short book. And the older I get, the more I like short books. Appia writes, in the final message my father left for me and my sisters, he wrote, "Remember, you're a citizen of the world, but as a leader of the independence movement in what was then the Gold Coast, he never saw a conflict between local partialities and universal morality, between being a part of the place you were and being a part of a broader human community. Raised with this father and an English mother, who was both deeply connected to our family in England and fully rooted in Ghana, where she has lived for half a century, I always had a sense of family and tribe that was multiple and overlapping. Nothing could seem more commonplace. A multiple and overlapping, nothing could seem more commonplace." Again, to return to the major points, and I will, after this section, I will end my lecture, hopefully within the next 10 minutes, going back to what I mean by teaching students to know, to care, and to act. Knowing, caring, and acting. That is how they relate. This is the diagram to showing the major concepts I'm trying to develop. Teaching students to know, to care, and to act. First, let me talk about knowing, caring, and acting in turn. I will start with knowing. First, we need to put the voices of women back into history while we're fixing it. We hear a lot about the men in the civil rights movement, such as King and Andrew Young, but other wonderful, important black women leaders have been marginalized, such as Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, and Daisy Bates. It seems to me that we need to make these women visible in the curriculum. And also, if you haven't seen the wonderful movie, Hidden Figures, please see it. It's the story of brilliant African-American women working in NASA. Let me give you an example of how putting women into the curriculum can help us to rethink and transform it. We often talk about Rosa Parks, the tired. But how does she tell the story? Rosa Parks was arrested for giving up her seat to a white rider. People often say she was tired. What does Mrs. Parks say about that event? She writes, "People always say that I didn't give up my seat because I was tired. But that isn't true. I was not tired physically. I'm no more tired than I usually was at the end of a working day. I was not old, although some people have an image of me of being old. I was 42. No, the only tired I was tired of giving in." We need to help students to rethink, to imagine, and to re-envision America. We need to help students to view events and concepts in the U.S. and the world from diverse perspectives. We need to rethink concepts such as the New World, the European discovery of America, pioneers and settlers, and the westward movement. I want you to ask your neighbor, just take 60 seconds to do this, what word might a Lakota Sioux Indian use for pioneer and settler? Just ask your neighbor, see if you can come up with the word. What word would... What word might a Lakota Sioux use for a pioneer or a settler? Okay, could we just get a couple? Shout out a couple. Could we shout out a couple? Invader. Yes, and I did this with one group of teachers, and they said illegal immigrants. We have to help our students get beyond words such as the discovery of America. Writes Richard White in his wonderful book, It's Your Misfortune and None of My Own, A New History of the West. He said the first European to penetrate the West arrived neither as conquerors nor as explorers. Like so many others that history has treated as discoverers, they were merely lost. Or it reminds me of the Dick Gregory joke of the man who stole the Cadillac. He told the police officer he discovered it. So you go out to the parking lot today and you find out your car has been discovered. We need to help students rethink concepts like discovery, concepts like the westward movement. The westward movement wasn't west for the Indians, it was their center of their home. Wasn't west for the Mexicans, it was north. Wasn't west for the Japanese, it was east. Wasn't west for the Alaskans, it was south. Westward movement. We have to teach kids to rethink concepts such as westward movement, such as pioneer and settlers. The pioneers and settlers for the Indians meant doom and death. We have to help students to rethink these issues and rethink America with new narratives, with new understandings. Writes the historian Patricia Limerick, she said the Mexicans came north, the Chinese and Japanese came east, the Alaskan went south, the Native Americans tried hard to stay put. They fought to stay where they were, they did not want to move. See her book, Patricia Nelson Limerick, called The Legacy of Conquest. Add it to the list. The Legacy of Conquest. We need a new, overarching historical narrative about the world in America. Ron Takaki, in his wonderful book, put it on the list, called A Different Mirror, tries to construct such a history of America, a multidimensional concept of America to help students develop a deep understanding, to know, to care, and to act. We also need to teach students to care. Horace Mann, in his commencement address at Antioch College in 1859, told the graduates to be ashamed to die until you won some victory for humankind. Margaret Mead said that a handful of thoughtful, committed people can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that has. To know, to care, and to act, we also need to teach students to act. If we know and we care, that's not enough. Remember I said Germany was one of the most sophisticated and educated societies on earth when the Holocaust took place. But it took place. People knew, they may have cared, but they didn't do what? They did not act. Acting is critical. Dante said that the worst place in hell is reserved for those who in times of great moral crisis take a neutral stand. Edmund Burke said that the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men and women to do nothing. How many of us would sit here and be neutral if it was announced that this building was on fire? We cannot be neutral in troubled times. We cannot be neutral when racism in this country is escalating and we have leaders who preach racism. We cannot be neutral. We have to know, we have to care, and we have to act. I'd like to share quotes from three of my heroes: Marion Wright Edelman, Audre Lorde, and Gloria Steinem, about action. Marion Wright Edelman says that service is the rent we pay for living. It is the very purpose of life and not something you do in your spare time. Audre Lorde says that your silence will not protect you. Gloria Steinem says that the root of oppression is the loss of memory. The root of oppression is the loss of memory. And I'm coming close to the end. Martin Luther King, whose life exemplified knowing, caring, and acting, was a transformative leader. In one of his last, and I think greatest speeches, he said, "It is my deep conviction that justice is indivisible, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. For those who tell me I'm hurting the civil rights movement and ask, don't you think that in order to be respected and in order to gain support, you must stop talking about the war? I can only say that I'm not a consensus leader. I do not seek to determine what is right and wrong by taking a Gallup poll to determine majority opinion. And it is again my deep conviction that ultimately a genuine leader is not a search of consensus, but a mold of consensus. On some position, the coward asks the question, is it safe? Expediency asks the question, is it politic? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? But conscience must ask the question, is it right? And there comes a time when one must take a stand that is neither safe, nor politic, nor popular, but one must take it because it is right. And that is where I find myself today. King also said that we will live together as brothers and sisters, or die separate and apart as strangers. Again, we will live together as brothers and sisters, or die separate and apart as strangers. To conclude, I'm going to conclude with a quote from my favorite writer, James Baldwin, who was also the only black that I read during my 4 years of undergraduate college at Chicago State University. And he remains my favorite essay writer today. In a famous speech, which you can Google, called A Talk to Teachers, I recommend you Google and read the entire speech. Baldwin gave this speech extemporaneously to a group of teachers in New York in 1963. And I'm ending with this quote because in it, Baldwin described the kind of thoughtful citizens we need to educate and the dire consequences of not doing so. He said the purpose of education is to create in a person to look at the world for himself, to make his own decisions, to say to himself that this is black or this is white, to decide for himself whether there's a God in heaven or not, to ask questions of the universe, and then to live with those questions is the way he achieved his identity. But no society is really anxious to have that kind of person around. What society really ideally wants is a citizenry that will simply obey the rules of society if a society succeeds in this, that society is about to perish. Thank you. Thank you.